Hey there, I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is an archived interview from Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. You can find more information about us, including how to support our efforts, at our website, theprogressivesouth.org. We're on a summer hiatus from Headlights while we work on adding some new features and content, but in the meantime, I wanted to highlight some of our interviews from the past year for anyone who missed them. Of course, you can find all our prior episodes, 57 so far, in the archives. This week, we're replaying a great interview with North Carolina journalist and storyteller Gwen Frisbie-Fulton. She's a writer who specializes in what she calls working-class stories, the daily lives of people in mostly small towns and rural communities. For context, we recorded this in March 2025. You can find her work at her Substack, linked in the show notes. So, Seth, let's go to the tape. Gwen Frisbie-Fulton is a writer and organizer in Greensboro, North Carolina, dedicated to amplifying the voices of working-class people in rural communities. She is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and has a master's degree from Valparaiso University. She has worked as an advocate and organizer with a variety of nonprofit organizations focused on issues including housing and food access. On her LinkedIn profile, she lists her pronouns as she, her, and y'all. With a deep commitment to racial justice and economic equality, her work is driven by a passion for challenging systemic inequities and advocating for the rights and dignity of poor and working-class people in the rural South. She is a regular columnist for Beacon Media, which provides content to newspapers across North Carolina, and you can find her writing many other places online, including a Substack called Working Class Storytelling. We will include links to those in the show notes. We are going to talk about the importance of storytelling in movements for justice and equality and the political dynamics of the rural South. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Gwen, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
So can we start with a bit of your own story? Where did this obvious sort of deep felt commitment that you have to justice and equality, and also to kind of the voices of people who are often left out of those conversations, where did that come from for you?
I mean, I think, a lot of it comes from growing up with incredible family and surrounded by folks who told stories, who sat on front porches. Dinner time is a long, involved activity in my family home. And so we were always talking, we were always sharing, we were always inviting other people in, and we were always listening to each other. And as I got older, I realized that we don't always have places we get to tell our stories. There's structures and systems in place where people here in my neighborhood don't ever get to articulate their own experiences. And not only did that seem like a big loss for our culture and our community, but it also seemed like a huge injustice that people can't, that people get stories told about them instead of getting to tell their own. So many years ago, I was actually living in the Midwest in Indianapolis, and I was living in a very poor, overwhelmingly white neighborhood called Fountain Square. And it's actually where my son was born. And while I was living there, a house a couple blocks away from me sold. And it was bought by what I learned was a white nationalist group. And they weren't from the neighborhood, but they moved into the neighborhood and turned this house to be their clubhouse. And they flew a neo-Nazi flag outside. They sort of dressed as skinheads and would go around the neighborhood, tagging up the neighborhood with swastikas and causing mayhem. And what I realized is they'd come to the neighborhood to recruit people because it felt like a dead-end place, right? This was a very high poverty, very high unemployment neighborhood with a lot of problems. But I also loved my neighbors, and I love myself, and I love my kid, and it seemed grossly unfair that we had to deal with this group. And I became concerned because I knew that my type of family was exactly the type of family they were targeting for recruitment. So I actually packed up and left, and I moved down here to Greensboro to raise my son. The reason I'm sharing that story is because a few years later, I realized that I thought I'd made the right decision by my family to remove ourselves from that situation, but I realized I'd left everyone else behind. And I just sort of closed off that neighborhood from my life. And this was at the same time that Donald Trump was elected and was coming into power. And that neighbor who had bought that house and turned it into a white nationalist clubhouse, I actually saw his face in Charlottesville. He was there marching with yet a new group at this point. And I realized that he was more empowered and had a sort of direct line to power. Well, when he was in my neighborhood, he was a fringe character. He was a problem, but he seemed like almost like a holdover of a dying yesteryear. And he seemed reinvigorated in Charlottesville. And that was an incredibly political moment for me, where I decided that I wanted to become more involved in politics, but I was doing it out of a way of protection of my communities. I was thinking about all the little kids who still lived up in that neighborhood, who I'd saved my own kid, but I'd left behind to be recruited by this group. And I thought about the lack of voice that any of my neighbors had there. I thought about how little anyone knew about them. And I started to think about issues of politics, justice, and storytelling, all as like one package.
You're especially focused on rural communities and small towns. And there's been a lot of talk in recent years about those places and the people who live in them. And we have the stereotype of the out-of-town reporter who flies in and talks to a couple of guys in MAGA hats at the diner. And of course, there's been criticism of that kind of parachute journalism and analysis. But you know, what's really going on in these communities? What is being missed by whether those stories are told by the left or the right or whoever's telling them? But what's missing from that picture?
Yeah. When I think about rural communities, and I think a lot about, I'm most familiar with North Carolina's rural communities. North Carolina's 100 counties. 85-ish are fully rural. Another 8 or 9 are sort of suburbanizing, sort of urbanizing, and then there's like 3 that are actually urban, counties. So it's a heavily rural state. And I became interested in rural North Carolina because I think 3 things are happening. We're very familiar with this story of economic divestment. We know that Wilkes County, North Carolina used to have incredible jobs in the furniture industry. And we know that those factories are gone, and, there's a Chick-fil-A and a Qdoba built where they used to be, and you can go in and order from somebody behind the counter, and they're like, yeah, I've worked here all my life. It just used to be a good job in this exact location, and now I'm doing this. So we know about that kind of divestment, and we know what happened from the 90s into the early 2000s and into now. And we know what that political backlash has looked like. So there's that kind of story of divestment that we're familiar with rural places. But we don't also think about this, the collapsing and divestment of local news, for example, into these communities. I work in counties and, where if they have a local paper, it's running once a week now. And it's just a few pages, and they've usually got some part-time staff. And these people are, valiantly trying to hold on and trying to keep some sort of news structure. But when you don't have local media, or when the TV news can't reach into the holler, they say, oh, that's an interesting story, but I can't go out there because we can't broadcast from there. You're lacking, one, that platform for people to talk to each other, but you're also losing the democratizing effects of media. Who's reporting on town council? And then the third way I think that rural communities have been divested in is politically. And I think that that is on the right and the left. I think that the sort of traditional Republican Party has not done a good job in rural communities talking to folks. And, sort of famously, we say that the Democrats haven't. But I really see it as both sides. And what's happened is into all those gaps that are created by all that divestment is this far-right movements have really seen the opportunity to move in and try to lay seed. But in every town I go to, I also see a lot of people resisting that and pushing back. And we miss that story. We miss that story when we drop into a diner.
Well, and that actually gets to one of the stories I wanted to ask you about. You wrote a great piece, which we will link to, about the experience of a small community staple restaurant in Albemarle.
Oh, yes.
Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Albemarle. Mm-hmm.
That had started hosting drag shows to serve the local community, mm-hmm. and that then became the target of backlash and organizing by Proud Boys who came in and kind of made an issue of it. I guess, can you talk a little bit about that story and the dynamic there? Because one of the things that struck me was that, groups like the Proud Boys tend to position themselves as being we're the defenders of traditional values and traditional small town values. But the actual people who lived in the small town, it was a beloved local resident, beloved local institution that had started hosting these drag shows. It was the Proud Boys who came in from outside and brought their agenda with them. So yeah, can you just kind of tell that story a little bit?
Oh yeah, I think it's a really interesting story because it's all about flag planting, right? Where this born and raised Stanley County mom, small business owner, ran Tiffany's at the Boardroom, which was her bar and eatery down on the main street of this small town, beautiful little town. And she'd been there for years and, had her regulars and had learned from her regulars that they were driving all the way to Charlotte for drag brunches, and they thought they were great. And she was coming out of COVID years running a restaurant and a bar and was trying to figure out new models and was just acting as a business owner and was like, when you hear that local folks are going an hour and a half away for something, as a business-minded folk, you figure out, well, how can I get in on this? And so she decided she was going to have a drag show. And immediately she started to receive, really ugly messages and, threats from local Proud Boys, or claimed to be local Proud Boys. As best we can tell, one of them was local. And the rest were imported from all over the state, trying to shut this down. And, the way she talks about it is so refreshing because she never saw herself as a political person. She was never taking a political stand. She saw herself as a businesswoman trying to figure out a new model to keep her business afloat after COVID, and that she was meeting local demand. She saw herself as a mom. She said she wasn't even sure if she was a Democrat or a Republican. This just wasn't her world. And all of a sudden she was being attacked as having an agenda. And what's so cool about it is she just stuck by her guns. She just went back on what her family had taught her, what she knew about her community, which is that you stand up for people, you don't act ugly. And as a business person, you try new things. And she insisted on holding this drag brunch. She ended up having an outpouring of support. And that's when I first ran into this story, is I'd heard that this was happening. I'd heard that the Proud Boys were planning on marching in the street outside of her business and trying to shut it down. And I drove to Little Albemarle, and the streets were absolutely packed with people supporting the drag show. And they came in from everywhere. And I think it's this idea where some of these far-right movements are trying to claim territory that isn't theirs. And just by sheer numbers game, Albemarle was clearly on the side of allowing a drag brunch to occur. And they were able to recapture back that narrative and mostly push the Proud Boys back out of town. And I just love it because I think local people, small town folks, just really regular people are doing that kind of work every day because they're refusing to get sucked into these sort of meta narratives that really, if they stop and pause, just don't describe their experience.
So that's obviously an example of your commitment to storytelling. And I want to talk about that word storytelling a little because it can sound a little, I think when you say storytelling, people kind of think of kids and maybe going to story time at the library and reading picture books and so forth. But obviously storytelling is a much broader thing, and it really encompasses an awful lot about how we learn about and experience the world. So how do you think of storytelling, and what are the ethics in your mind of storytelling? I mean, we think about journalism ethics in terms of getting facts and names right and so forth, but storytelling to me sounds a little more, really trying to tell somebody's story. You're taking on a lot of responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. What do I mean by storytelling? I use the word probably 40 times a day. I should probably come up with some succinct definition, but as a storyteller, I won't do that. I think that, stories, we live and breathe in stories, especially in the South. It's really the way folks communicate. It's the way it's the way we as parents describe caution and put boundaries around for our children. I was definitely told some spooky stories that probably kept me in the yard as a kid. And I've repeated that as a mom. We also relate to each other through stories. When my neighbor comes home this evening, he and I will, chat out in the front yards together, and we'll tell each other stories from our day. We'll laugh, together. And I think it's a really natural way for people to communicate, especially in the South. We are storytelling creatures down here. And I think sometimes that gets really lost. It gets lost in sort of marketing language, and it gets lost in when you tell people like, we just have to follow all the facts. And it's like, that's just not actually the way we operate. I like facts. They're cool, but it's really not the way we move through our day. And I think, but stories are. And so when I think about how that looks ethically, I would never claim to be a journalist. I'm not that rigorous. I'm also interested in how somebody is describing their own experience, their own organizing, their own family, their own community, and honoring that. So I sometimes use the phrase bottom-up storytelling or democratic storytelling, where it's more participatory, where I'm saying to somebody, this is what I'm hearing you say, and I'm saying it back to them, and then we're continuing on a conversation to make sure I'm getting it right, because I don't see it as my story. I see it as something that I'm bringing along for somebody who probably doesn't have a lot of access, who doesn't have a lot of opportunity to tell their own story. And I feel this sort of immense privilege to be able to maybe move their story in front of some eyes that wouldn't have seen it.
And how and why do you think storytelling can be important and powerful as a mechanism for, organizing, for building community movements and working toward change?
Yeah. I think the obvious answer is stories are activating our hearts, and maybe our minds as well. But we move with our hearts. We move through empathy. We move through connections. And what stories are doing is they're telling you that this stranger isn't that strange. This stranger and you have a lot of commonality. There's a lot of places you overlap. And through the process of telling stories, you're also creating a collaborative environment. So when you encourage somebody who is organizing in their own community to share their story when they talk to a neighbor, they're not doing that to convince them or persuade them of something. They're doing that to open a door for that neighbor to then tell them a story. And so it's sort of this long conversation that all good organizing should be. That's an invitation in, and there's a collaborative nature to it. That's really different than doing hard electoral organizing where you're giving a pitch, right? It's really different to do community organizing. It's slower. It's more broad and inclusive and expansive, and I think a story sort of sets the tone for that.
What do you look for in stories? What stories? Because obviously there are millions of stories out there. What draws you to a story and says, this is a story I want to know more about and a story that I want to tell?
Man, I'm a sucker for a working class hero. I just love people who are moving instinctually through their community and doing things because they just gutturally woke up knowing it was the right thing to do, versus somebody who feels super prepared and is highly trained for it. I just love somebody who is like, I am running into this fire and we're going to sort it out once we're in there. I just think that there's something so pure about that. I also love stories that are really surprising. Stories that are showing that we're all made of multiple parts.
So as a tool or an approach to social change and justice, what if there's somebody out there who is interested in this and thinks, yeah, that's a way I could contribute. That's something I could do, but I don't know how to. I don't know, how to start. What would you tell people to do? Where did you start?
Where I started is I'm a single mom, and I've always worked one or two jobs, and any parent knows that, you get off work and you come home and you have this short window of time to make dinner, maybe water the garden, probably not, bath time and bedtime. And those are precious moments. And then after all of that flurry of activity, you're then in the house and you can't leave because the kids are asleep. And so I longed for, my life before being a mama, where I was involved in all kinds of organizing and activism, much of which happened for people in their 20s after 8 p.m. And very little of my life happened after 8 p.m. when I was 27 with a toddler. And so I realized that my contribution could be through writing. And I just would write Facebook posts and people would share them, and I was floored. But there's something that being a parent does for you where you do have to step back, and I'm so grateful for it, because you do have to become more of an observer. And I became really interested in seeing different people in my community and the amazing work that they were doing, and being able to be backed away from it enough to start seeing the connections from a slightly removed place. And what I would say to folks is that every town has so many stories to be told, and they're so important to be told, and who tells them matters. Many stories, especially about small towns in the South, are told by outsiders and sort of fit tropes and stereotypes that we who are here understand aren't always true. And so we have to become narrators of our own communities, historians of our own communities, and start documenting. And so I don't think it's about being, a lovely writer, and it's certainly not about punctuation. I stand by that. It is, but it's absolutely about like who has the mic and who's talking. And that's the work that I'm most interested in. I'm really interested in showing local people who are probably already doing this a little bit in their own communities, that posting on Facebook and narrating the community and your observations around you is a valid way of communication. You don't have to be on MSNBC. In fact, I'd rather you not be. And I think that people who are doing local organizing, whatever that looks like, whether you're running a community garden or you're helping your friend run for mayor, documenting and bringing more voices into that is never a bad move.
Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you is we're sitting in your living room, and out on your porch, I can see you have a banner that says "Better South."
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? What is a better South?
Yeah. I mean, I think the South's pretty darn good. Don't get me wrong. I really rebuke when people say, especially after an election, why do y'all still live there? Why don't you move? Why don't you come up here to this nice place? And I think to myself, we have so much to offer the rest of the country. We are, because things are so rough, because we wear everything on our sleeve in the South. Nothing's hidden here. We know what our history is. We know what the sides are. And still there's, hundreds and thousands and millions of people here in the South who every day are choosing to stay and do good things. I feel like it's better South is something we're actively building. I tell people from the North all the time, I'm like, y'all, we gave you Fannie Lou. We gave you Martin Luther King. We gave you the Tennessee Three. Like, these characters, these leaders, this culture can only come from a place that's this hot. And we just need other people to believe in us as well, and listen to what local folks are saying to realize that we're not these stereotypes. And we're certainly not the NCGA.
Well, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and love your writing, punctuation or not. it's terrific, and I think everybody should go give it a look. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
And that wraps up this archive interview. Remember, you can find any episodes you've missed right here in our archives. We'll talk to you soon.